Dunning, and I want to welcome you to our panel today. This fall, and beginning with today's panel on urban public lands, the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies is celebrating the Centennial of the National Park Service. In a series of discussions titled A Century of American Conservation, Reinvesting in the Stewardship of Our National Parks, Public Lands, and Natural Resource Legacy, a range of practitioners and researchers will discuss the challenges and opportunities for building on the nation's efforts to preserve, protect, and restore the nation's natural resource legacy. In 1916, the U.S. Congress created the National Park Service, a first-of-its-kind institution dedicated to managing and protecting the nation's most extraordinary places for the enjoyment of everyone. The service was one piece in a revolutionary conservation movement fueled by a novel notion that some parks, reserves, and forests should remain in the public hands and managed for the long term. And from those earliest days, Yale has played a key role. In the early 20th century, the nation's first forest chief, Gifford Pinchot, decided to establish a school of forestry on the campus of his alma mater, laying the foundation for what has become one of the world's premier environmental schools. In the decades since, the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies has pioneered efforts to bring focus to these conservation issues, trained resource management professionals who have been entrusted with managing these national resources, and promoted solutions to the challenges that they face. The 4 panels convened this semester have been co-organized by faculty and staff in partnership with alumni, centers and programs, researchers, student conservation groups, together to bring critical conversations to the forefront. This afternoon's panel will focus on urban public land issues because we now know that in the 21st century, the world will be largely shaped by what happens in cities. Today, more than half the world's population lives in urban areas, and each week, the urban population grows globally by 1.3 million people. Led by our moderator, Dr. Nina Roberts, today's panel will grapple with challenging questions for the future, exploring how urban public lands can help our cities be more resilient and offer a better quality of life for urban dwellers. I have the pleasure of introducing our panel moderator, Dr. Nina Roberts, who will certainly share more about herself with you directly, but I want to share with you that she is a professor in the Department of Recreation, Parks, and Tourism at San Francisco State University. Dr. Roberts is also the director of the Pacific Leadership Institute, an urban-based outdoor adventure program that serves more than 10,000 people each year. Prior to her arrival at SFSU, she worked for the National Park Service and for the Student Conservation Association, as well as a variety of urban youth programs from coast to coast. She continues to support the National Park Service as a social scientist involved with community engagement, youth evaluation, and as a consultant for aspects from cultural competency training to recruitment and retention. Please help me welcome Dr. Roberts, who will kick off our panel and moderate the session. Thank you.
Okay, good. Great. Thank you. Hi. Thanks for being here. This is very exciting, and we're honored to be part of this particular series, and you're in for a treat in terms of this illustrious panel here. So really, first, how many students are here? Just a quick show of hands. Students. Great. Excellent. Faculty, instructors. Great. Any staff who just want to? Excellent. Great. Thank you for being here, everybody. Colleen has asked us to first thank you for that introduction. Just a couple of other things in terms of my work and my career. It has been a wonderful opportunity in terms of some of the work that I've done before coming into higher education, in terms of my work at SF State. The director of the Pacific Leadership Institute, we work with youth all over the Bay Area and the state of California, including partnership with the Golden Gate National Rec Area and the Conservancy. And I'll also be incoming working with the Institute for Civic and Community Engagement, keeping a toehold in that work in our local communities. I had the pleasure of studying in India a few years ago, which was just a remarkable experience. Anybody travel to India in particular? I know I'm sure a lot of you have traveled abroad. It's a remarkable place. I am a native New Yorker, so it's great to be back east. I'm spending this fall semester in Washington, D.C., working with the National Parks Conservation Association as I take a little sabbatical and work on additional community engagement. So just a little bit more about myself. So what I'm going to do is I just want to talk a little bit about Some social trends in urban areas. This is just a teaser because this is going to be very brief and somewhat quick. So put your seatbelts on and hang in there with me because then I'm going to introduce the panelists and they're going to talk about the work that they do. So in general, as was mentioned, landscapes are changing dramatically and really interesting ways, I might add. So first, if you think back to when the National Park Service was established by the Organic Act in 1916, 50%, that's still a good number of people who lived in cities, but if you notice the trend up to now, it's a little bit over 80%. And it is continuing to grow, but growing in actually unique directions. So in terms of the largest 25 cities, it's about 12% growth over a 3-year period. That's pretty extraordinary considering there's 308 million people as of the last census in the US today. So what we see here then too is this is just a list of those top 25 in terms of the growth, and these are the top 5: Austin, Charlotte, Denver, Washington, Seattle. Right, so you can see where some of these other states lie, and again, this just represents the growth in terms of population in these areas. What you're seeing here just came out the other day. This is September in the New York Times. U.S. household grew 5.5, right, as far as income, because people are talking about the middle class and a shrinking middle class, and there is some truth to that. However, what we are seeing, however, in the last couple of years, the median income has risen, but it's still below pre-recession. Okay, so we are seeing a shift, but the key is how has it varied over the last several years? So a couple of other things here. Influx of young people, right? Millennials, you can see when you were born in terms of if you fall into that category. Moving into cities, so that's where a lot of the growth is. Younger populations are moving into cities. However, racial minorities, there's a mass exodus moving out because of displacement and lack of ability in terms of affordable housing. So that's something to keep an eye on. In terms of urban planning and natural resources, what we're seeing on the positive angle, right? There's redevelopment of riverfronts and other water districts. That's a powerful, powerful development in urban areas and beautifying those parts of cities. Leadership, partnerships, improving, renovating vacant lots and playground and creating playgrounds in some of these empty used spaces. Celebrating industrial heritage. Every city has its industrial area. And so a lot of what we're seeing is really revitalizing those areas and creating green space in the vicinity of those spaces as well. Stable, accessible public transportation. Many cities are still working with that, grappling with that, having some challenges around public transportation. But the more they increase that, and including energy production, then we start to see some shifts in the use of public transit in these different cities. In terms of challenges, lots of challenges as we know. And I bring up some of the good and the bad because there's a lot of things that we need to discuss and really talk about in terms of the work we're doing in parks and urban planning. Housing, #1 factor in terms of inequality, nationwide, no question. A couple of other things. The middle class is still shrinking. Now, the median income is different than the average, but it's down 6.5%, almost 7%. Environment, climate change in terms of less green space, fewer parks. So it's still, you see the urban renewal, right? But that's the direction that we're heading. These are still issues in a lot of places. Racial inequality is alive and well, unfortunately, but in terms of education, healthcare, poverty, segregation, it's alive and well. So we need to determine as leaders and managers of these programs, how do we improve that and mitigate some of these issues? Gun violence, rampant, right? How do we reduce that and some of the work that you all are doing now? Public transit, again, food deserts. In terms of minority communities. This is a cartoon that I saw a couple of years ago, and I love this because when we think about the need to maintain and preserve these public spaces, what the actual caption was this would be a great place to put a huge city, right? And so the point of this cartoon is that some of our green spaces are still being diminished, and there's a lot of problems in our green spaces, so we want to avoid this is part of why I put that up there. Okay, so National Park Service. I want to talk a little bit about the National Park Service. If you're not familiar, it's called the National Park Service. It's the urban agenda. How many people have been following that or understand, right? Here's a couple of things that the NPS is doing. It actually started in 2012 when they created this urban agenda. They've always had national parks in urban areas since the 70s or so, east and west, when they were developed. So they created in 2012 at the City Park Alliance Conference this urban agenda. In Park Service, about 40 out of 50 of the most populous cities, we have sites. More than a third of all sites are located in cities, about 30% of the current operating budget. So there is an important component to the national parks in urban areas. 36%, okay, of all park visitation occurs in these urban units. All right, and then you see the employment, just shy of 20% of the people who work in national parks live in urban areas. All right, so think about that. They generate about a little over $4.5 billion in economic output. I apologize about the slides are kind of blending. It's just a technology thing, but that's life, right? That's not the way it was. But 26% of total economic output, national parks vegetation. You get the idea. But that's why we check our slides before we show them. So here's a couple of strategies of what the urban agenda is doing. All right, a couple of things. Greening Youth Foundation, if you're not familiar, they're doing a lot of good work. These are partners working with the NPS. Here's an example of where they're working with HBCUs, career exploration, providing new experiences for students. So there's a lot of efforts around students, and here's the other one, the Student Conservation Association. If you're not familiar, and you are eligible, students in the house, to participate in the NPS Academy, which is career development, as well in terms of just understanding different ways that they're providing training for young people across cultural differences. Here's another one at National Parks Conservation Association. They are working with urban park units across the nation in terms of helping them with new ways of thinking and developing tools to engage community partners. So that's one example of the kinds of things that they're doing in terms of relationship building, and that's a lot of what it takes. So the urban agenda, there are 10 urban fellows. And these are folks that are both within the park system and external professionals who work in the field of conservation and environmental studies. They're building alliances with education institutions, with foundations, with nonprofit organizations. So they're working collectively and collaboratively with the national parks. And so you have this whole idea of these learning tenets, right, and communities of practice. And that's a big part of what they're doing as far as these urban fellows in the urban agenda. So very quick, kind of an overview, a little bit of a teaser. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists. They'll chat with you, and then we're going to engage in a little Q&A with the panelists. And then we're going to open it up to everyone here. So take good notes and let us know what kind of questions and comments that you have as we get through the panel. So Michael, it's good to see him again. We met years ago. He's in the field of urban planning, public health, science, technology. You see his bio up here. He looks at how the built environment, policymaking, these social movements, how does it influence sustainability, right, and population health in low-income neighborhoods and communities of color in particular. He has experience with the California State Legislature. He worked with the Assembly, the Committee on Environmental Justice, and he worked with the Capital Planning Commission. So Michael's going to be chatting with us here first. Adam is also, he's in New York. He's worked in a variety of estuaries throughout his career. Scientist, planner, both at multiple levels, local, state, and federal, which is great because then you understand the differences between them, which is so important as we know. His primary interest revolves around science, society, and the environment. How many people have that interest as well? Science, society, and the environment. That's a big part of what goes on here in this college. He is local, sort of local, Brooklyn, lives with his family there, and he's got to go outside, forcing everybody to get outside. Kate, my friend and colleague, Kate Bickert, she is really interested and very passionate about understanding a sense of place and meaning, about why people and how people connect to the outdoors and encouraging that connection, but also learning to understand that connection herself. She likes to find ways to help people engage and embrace new connections as well. And so especially people who, being in the Bay Area, people who may not have those opportunities, Kate's always in the forefront of bringing people together. And you're going to have to ask her what MODs are, because I think that's something pretty unique. But she does live in San Francisco with her family, and if you're into snakes, you can have a conversation with Kate after the panel. So, all right, here we go. And I'm going to invite Michael up to work his magic, and then we'll move on from there.
Thank you. Thank you, Nina, for that very energetic and welcoming introduction. And it's an honor to be here for the very first celebration of the National Park Service Centennial. So thank you. And so today I'll be talking about my area of expertise, particularly looking at urban spaces and issues of social equity. My presentation will focus on the multiple benefits of urban greening or urban green infrastructure at that nexus between climate change, public health, and environmental justice. So before I start my presentation, I want to give a quick overview of what I'll be covering today. I'll be covering that nexus between climate change management and urban greenery or infrastructure, and looking particularly at multi-benefit, multi-purpose type of projects, looking at environmental justice implications of such projects, looking at a macro scale, statewide case example, then kind of zoom in and give a couple local case examples, finally concluding with policy recommendations. So to begin with, So as you heard before, as we are aware, the impacts of climate change are often felt the greatest in highly densely populated urban areas. Cities are now seeing increased cases, severity, and duration of heat waves, poor air quality, flooding, and drought. Local urban planners are working hard to mitigate the causes of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, as well as adapting cities to make them more comfortable in a rapidly changing environment and resilient to extreme weather events. Urban green projects can play an important role as green solutions to energy conservation and air quality improvement, both which contribute to mitigating and adapting to climate change. In addition to sequestering carbon, trees and other green infrastructure can modify temperatures, filter air pollutants such as particulate matter, conserve energy, and address the urban heat island effect. So yes, urban greening projects can address climate change, but it's also important to note that they provide many benefits to the community and the greater ecosystem. Projects like green alleys, watershed management, and parks can be designed to achieve multiple objectives, provide integrated approaches, and result in more beneficial outcomes. For example, a park can be designed as a single-purpose facility, or it can be designed with multiple objectives to provide both active and passive recreation, wildlife habitat restoration, stormwater collection, energy conservation, water quality improvements, and neighborhood beautification. So as cities are starting to plan on major capital investments and spending millions of dollars, we must stop and ask, what are the multiple benefits of this green infrastructure? And more importantly, whom do they serve? So this brings us to the environmental justice implication. What exactly does it mean to environmental justice communities? As we plan for a 21st century type of infrastructure, we got to look at more innovative approaches and not use 20th century infrastructure. And as we move forward on these infrastructure projects, we have to look at environmental justice. In California adopted what's called the California Environmental Health Screening Tool. So this was an environmental justice campaign, a community-driven campaign over 10 years to really create a science-based tool to really document what does environmental justice mean, where is it, and how do you define it. And they used these scientific metrics on 20 indicators of pollution burden, exposure, and socioeconomic factors. So if you look at this map, the dark red and orange spaces are the areas that are most polluted, have the most cumulative impacts, and have the most socially vulnerable populations. So the environmental justice community worked 10 hard years to get this institutionalized into state government to help affect the allocation of resources and programs, particularly dealing with the environment. So they argued that these communities that have the most burden and that are the most socially vulnerable should be targeted for that finite resources that we have. So this was a really idea of an equity framework. And this really came out of because of California's cap and trade law. So California is the only state in the United States that has a cap and trade program, a comprehensive and regulatory program to address the issue of climate change. And that cap and trade program is bringing billions of dollars to California over the last 3 years. Those billions of dollars were initially just slated for global greenhouse gas reductions, regardless of scale or location. The environmental justice community really fought hard through a 4-year campaign, also using the CalEnviro screen to really say that these investments, the hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars coming into California should be targeted to low-income communities of color. And what essentially after 4 years and one veto, they finally got signed into law, Senate Bill 535, SB 535, which takes 35% of the billions of dollars coming into California and targeted into environmental justice communities. And with that enactment of that law, they targeted those hundreds of millions of dollars, that 35%, to 5 key program areas. One is low carbon transportation, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and more importantly, what we're talking about here today, community greening. So that's urban forestry, community gardens, green roofs, watershed management practices. So more colloquially, this SB 535 bill is known as the Climate Change Community Benefits Fund. So in the first year that this was enacted into law and the legislature allocated money, about almost $3 million went to disadvantaged communities, and of that, $30 million went for urban forestry and community greening. And if we look over the last 3 years, almost $500 million has gone to disadvantaged communities throughout the region in California. So the Climate Change Community Benefits Fund really shows how people are creating and defining an equity framework when we're creating 21st century type of urban greening projects. Really looking at an equity framework and capital investments, really ensuring that these capital investments, these 21st century type of projects, have multiple benefits that are targeted to disadvantaged communities. This new infrastructure, when it's developed, really not only should tackle cost effectiveness, but also look at how can it promote community and social change. And again, multi-purpose projects, watershed management, recreation, community facilities, water filtration and treatment sites. All these also provide public health benefits. They both do, sequester carbon and provide adaptation options, water saving techniques, which is very important in California because of our historic and epic drought. And access to green space. Many of the urban areas are overdeveloped. So these multi-purpose projects and low-income communities are redeveloping formerly toxic sites, brownfield sites, and adds for community development. So quickly looking at a more smaller scale, what do some of these communities look like that are potentially getting funding from the Community Benefits Fund? If we look at the Sun Valley watershed, which is in the northeast San Fernando Valley, about 25 miles northeast of downtown, it's an environmental justice community. You can see from the map, the dark red and orange, high levels of concentration there. So they have a lot of environmental justice issues. One of them has to do with historic flooding. They have poor infrastructure, poor drainage and sewer systems, and even we have a drought in California, and even when it does rain, that inadequate infrastructure is clogged, and it really floods the streets and makes them unpassable, really creating also a lot of urban runoff and creating a very toxic soup of water flowing through these residential communities. So a lot of companies, a lot of agencies, LA City, LA County, and Tree People, which is one of the largest urban forestry CBOs in the country, came together and looked at what ways can we do to address environmental justice and historic flooding in this area. And they created the Sun Valley Watershed Management Plan, which is about a $300 million investment that's going to happen over 10 to 15 years. And the Sun Valley Park is one of the first pilot projects that was developed in 2006. And as you can see, there's cisterns there that collects water from the 22 residential acre area, and it collects the water, it treats water on site, and then recharges the groundwater there. At the same time, they're also creating additional recreational opportunities through soccer fields, and other community spaces. Another project that's breaking ground on in summer of 2017 is this wetlands park in Sun Valley, which is a 46-acre park that formerly was a landfill brownfield site. So that's another reuse project. Tree People, who spearheaded the Sun Valley Watershed Management Project, also looks at other innovative type of approaches. Where can we put more green space in urban areas that are already overdeveloped? So this year alone, they created 225 greening projects in schools because they're the centers of our community. And these areas that they're creating additional recreational space, cisterns for water treatment, permeable spaces, climate-appropriate landscaping, water filtration, and more trees. So this is a picture of Broadus Elementary in Pacoima. This is right adjacent to Sun Valley, the Sun Valley Watershed Management. So this is a high environmental justice community. Again, using an equity framework, they're putting a lot of their resources in environmental justice communities. And this is a picture of after. So this was another pilot project. They've done hundreds now throughout LA, and this is before the drought, so there's a lot of grass there. But most of them now have all climate appropriate kind of landscaping. And then finally, this is a project that I personally worked on in Northern California in Sacramento on a 2.5 instructional urban farm and community garden that's right next to an elementary school and a high school, and the largest public housing project in Northern California. What's unique about this project is just north of of the school site is an industrial site that just it's getting redeveloped. So developers developing 500 new homes there. So what happened here is that the community, the developer, the city, the county, and the school district all came together to create a community benefits agreement where instead of the developer paying impact fees for school impact fees, park impact fees, and that went to the general fund, this is the first time in California that it actually got localized to this particular site. So over the 10 years, over $3 million, it's going to be localized to not only develop this site, but also to maintain the site going forward. So policy recommendations very quickly. Again, as we create 21st century infrastructure project focused on green infrastructure, they need to be multi-benefit, multi-purpose projects, defined equity, ensuring that our communities that need it most get this type of infrastructure. We need innovative financing mechanisms, as we saw as the Community Benefits Fund and for climate change cap and trade, or the Community Benefits Agreement we saw in the urban farm. And then thirdly, more important sometimes than funding is breaking down department silos. Getting all these, the county, the sanitation department, the parks and rec, and city planning department to all sit together and change their rules to do multi-purpose, multi-benefit project is actually a very hard process. When I sat on the planning commission, that was actually, just to do green alleys was a huge hurdle. Fourthly is we need tools to track and calculate co-benefits. If we're going to have multi-purpose projects, we need to document how are we reducing greenhouse gas emissions, how many green jobs are we creating, what other type of access to green spaces we're enabling. Fourthly is grants for ongoing maintenance and urban greening projects. Not only should we have them be financed to develop them, a lot of these low-income communities, these very disadvantaged cities themselves don't have money to maintain these projects. And then lastly, finally, is community engagement, having community engagement through the whole financing, planning, development, and ongoing maintenance of these projects. So thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Adam Paris, the Executive Director of the Science and Resilience Institute. I want to thank Nina for her leadership in pulling the panel together, as well as all the folks at Yale, especially Colleen. So I'm going to just tell a story about a place that is facing probably all of these trends and challenges and opportunities, and that is Jamaica Bay, which is in New York City. This is what Jamaica Bay looked like in the mid-1800s. Pretty common story for coastal areas in the U.S. You've got a lot of extensive complex of wetlands here. You can see development happening in Brooklyn, starting to densify right up in the upper northwest, and there's Manhattan. So this is a much different New York City than you see today. And then gradually over the next 100 years, and really even the last 50 years, this was a landscape that was transformed by urbanization and economic development specifically. We lost probably upwards of 90+% of the wetlands that were in Jamaica Bay around the edge, the perimeter, but we still have 10,000 acres, and I'll get back to that in a second. Most of the transportation systems, there's probably one subway line that runs out here. This is Floyd Bennett Field, which is a part of the Gateway National Recreation Area, and I'll show the other parklands. Most of the areas that you see in green are a part of Gateway National Recreation Area, which has as many, about 3 million visitors a year, so probably on the level of Yosemite or Yellowstone. Same number of visitors annually, which is kind of mind-boggling if you think about it, that there's this national park in the middle of what people think of as really just a city, an urbanized area. But it's a testament to the number of people that have access to the bay. The channels around the inlet channel, this is the Rockaway Inlet, and the channels around the bay were dredged extensively because the vision was that this area would be a port. This would be the next great port for New York City. And Indeed, actually, Floyd Bennett Field was a major military installation during World War II. So they actually pulled up aircraft carriers right up to this edge of the inlet channel, and there were all sorts of military planes coming in and out of Floyd Bennett Field. What that has done effectively is create this big, deep channel that funnels water from the New York Bight into Jamaica Bay on a storm surge. And this is what it looks like demographically. Each of these dots equals 20 people, and all the different colors show the racial diversity. And this is courtesy of some work that an architect who works with us at the Science and Resilience Institute did in her project called Structures of Coastal Resilience. That was Catherine Sievert Nordenson. But you can see a tremendous amount of diversity in the population surrounding the bay. And I'll just go back really quickly. So if you look at the 1800s map, actually is useful because it shows the topography. And if you take into account the entire watershed of the bay, you can actually pick up and fit Manhattan in the watershed. If you cut Manhattan up into less of an elongate structure, you could actually fit it in the tidal waters of Jamaica Bay. So we're talking about not a trivial amount of space and not a trivial amount of parkland. So there's 10,000 acres of parklands in Jamaica Bay, 7,000 of which are part of the national park system, a part of Gateway National Recreation Area. But then there's also this, this additional, in light green, this additional space of 3,000 acres of city parklands. So this is really, there are probably places in New York City, smaller parcels with higher ecological value in terms of the health and biodiversity. But if you were looking for an area within New York City limits and of open space, contiguous open space with tremendous potential for public access, education, and ecological restoration, this is it. Around the mid-90s, coincident with the sort of the legacy effects of these development around Jamaica Bay, the community started to notice some of the impacts to water quality specifically, and you don't see it on this graph because it only goes back to 1999, but in the mid-90s, about 60,000 pounds of nitrogen were flowing into the bay every day. And that was largely because there was no treatment, so this was raw, urban runoff flowing into the bay. They worked with the city. It was not the greatest relationship in the beginning, but eventually the city passed Local Law 71, the Jamaica Bay Watershed Protection Plan, and has since invested billions of dollars in some state-of-the-art wastewater treatment plants and a number of different measures, both green and gray, wetland restoration, living breakwaters. DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, just did installed 50,000 oysters in the bay to test out different strategies for using oyster restoration to clean the water and sediment in the bay. So we're down to about probably actually more like 20,000 pounds per day, but we still have a long way to go. Tremendous amount of investment in the bay, and for that reason, when the Obama administration actually leaned forward with the Great American Outdoors Initiative, the city teamed up with the national parks. This was at the time, former Mayor Michael Bloomberg, and Secretary Ken Salazar, to release a request for expressions of interest to start a center focused on science and resilience in Jamaica Bay to really provide the information to bring about transformation in the bay, both in terms of public access, in terms of restoration and education. So the reason I show this slide is to point out these dates right here. So the submissions for these proposals to host and lead this center were due a week before Sandy hit. So you had this tremendous institutional inertia. You had a policy mechanism, you had interest at local, state, and federal levels, a partnership among multiple scales of government to focused around socio-ecological resilience to start this center and have that be, the linchpin in reactivating and re-energizing the parklands in Jamaica Bay. And then the focus shifted. Sandy hit. We still got the proposal in, with CUNY leading a consortium of 9 different universities. And I'm actually an employee of CUNY, but we got the center. But there were tremendous impacts around the Bay. And the really important thing is that this shifted some of the sort of policy and community position from just more of a heavy emphasis on socio-ecological resilience to also climate resilience and I would say disaster risk reduction. So we have many different meanings of resilience in Jamaica Bay, and we're trying to embrace that. The mission of the Institute is to produce integrated knowledge to increase biodiversity, well-being, and adaptive capacity in Jamaica Bay. And what we're trying to do is not necessarily have that come solely from the scientific community, but when we say integrated knowledge, certainly we mean interdisciplinary science and research, but we also mean taking what we know from science, taking what we know from the communities, the people who live in and around the Bay, and they're there and they observe it day to day and they steward the Bay, and what we know from public policy and resource management. And we're trying to harmonize that around some common goals for the Bay. And just so you know, this is not just a notion. This conceptual diagram that shows our sort of networks of partners and affiliates and the larger network of stewards that we work with inside and outside of government and inside and outside of academia. This is right down to our DNA. So our board actually consists of members from the community. Our board consists of funders of 8 public agencies, including the city, multiple agencies of the city, the State Department of Environmental Conservation, likely the Army Corps of Engineers, and all of the 9 universities that make up that you see here on the bottom that produce the science that folks actually need and that fit with the priorities for the Bay. So we like to call this the hidden heart of New York City, and the vision is to use this place to transform the identity of New York City into something and realize the vision for sustainability and resilience, the mayor's vision, One NYC. Most recently, just to give you an example, we had a State of the Bay symposium in mid-June, and we really worked hard to get folks from all different types of communities at the Bay, and we front-loaded the symposium with folks from the agencies and the communities saying what is their perspective on resilience post-Sandy. What is their perspective on resilience? And then the second day we actually, and then we had a boat ride, and folks actually were forced to bond with each other, because I'm not sure if you've ever had a boat ride as part of your public event or your conference, but it's really great. It forces people to bond. They can't sort of hide behind the PowerPoints or hide behind receptions. They can actually talk and interact. And then we had a full day of all different kinds of scientific presentations. And what we're seeing, whether it's in the general management plan for Gateway, the Jamaica Bay Watershed Protection Plan, the mayor's sustainability and resiliency plan, are shared priorities. Restoration, we've got to make restoration more feasible. It costs $1 million an acre to restore wetlands in New York City, which is cost prohibitive. Particularly when you're looking at flood protection and other options like hard or gray infrastructure. Water, we have to conserve the amount and quality of water. We've lost some of the freshwater inflow. We still have water quality impacts. Education, in order for folks to care about the Bay, they have to actually be able to experience it, but experience it in a way that's meaningful. Participation, who makes the decisions and how? So we're working with the Participatory Budgeting Project and trying to create participatory processes to set these priorities, well-being, defining what lifestyles and quality of life means, and innovation. And when you look at the Coastal Zone Management Act of 1972, I would say this is a dramatic shift. So Jamaica Bay is emblematic or symbolic of all the different, what's happened in the coastal zone in America. Congress recognized it for natural, commercial, recreational, ecological, industrial, and aesthetic resources. But it goes on to say those are competing uses, and it's had a tremendous impact. So in some respects, I think what we're doing in Jamaica Bay is raising the standard of care. And that's it. Thanks.
All right, now we have Miss Kate Biggert.
All right,
We'll open it up
thanks,
for some Q&A.
Nina, for the introduction. It's really fun to be back here at Yale. It's been a long time since I was back. So I'm going to talk a little bit, I hope I'm pressing, about the park that I work for and the urban setting that I work in, and then actually just go into some examples that are very local in scale as to how we have tried to try some new ways of engaging populations, particularly diverse populations from the Bay Area in our park and in things like ecosystem science, resilience, stewardship of parklands, et cetera. So I work for the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy. It is the nonprofit partner to the National Park Service Golden Gate National Recreation Area and the Presidio Trust, which are the two primary landowners in the Bay Area. It extends 40 miles north of the Golden Gate Bridge, 40 miles south of the Golden Gate Bridge, encompasses 80,000 acres, nestled in a 7 million plus area population-wise. So it's very urban. You can see that the city of San Francisco and many others just go right up against our park. This is the Presidio. Our park is the most visited in all of the national parks. We have between 14 and 17 million people that come to the park every year. So it's huge in terms of trying to manage it, trying to engage people of what's going on there. So I think, one of the things that I wanted to talk about today is we spend a lot of time talking about, what are parks for? And we talk a lot about the value that parks play in terms of the ecology of a place, in terms of quality of life. But I think one of the things for me that's been really interesting over the last 13 years that I've worked here is really starting to think that parks have actually another role to play, and that is to be a really important civic institution in a local community where people can come together and explore ideas, talk about issues that are really relevant to the world that we're living in right now, and that they can be kind of these natural places of reconciliation, most broadly. For the Park Service's Centennial year, the Park Service has been really talking a lot, obviously, about celebrating the past, what the Park Service has meant in the past, but really also, I think, focusing on what is the Park Service going to mean in the 21st century, really focused on the future. So for us in our park, what we were thinking about in this year was what new partnerships did we want to look at to take us into the 21st century, new participants, again, making our park really relevant and accessible to the broadest cross-sector of our community, and particularly engaging folks who don't normally come to the park or who we don't see there. And then again, how do we set ourselves up for the next century? So this is what we were sort of looking at. How can our public lands really be sort of a place where all of these other public civic institutions kind of come together and we can help each other? So we work with public schools, public health organizations, public art, and libraries, other kind of institutions like that. What I wanted to say about parks to the people, so Nina kind of referenced this, in the 70s there were a lot of really great activists with a lot of foresight who said we have these incredible national parks like Yosemite and Yellowstone and Grand Canyon, and we but we need to make sure that park experiences are available and more accessible to everyone. So that kind of became the Parks to the People movement. So that happened in the 70s. That's when our park was established, 1974. One of the things that we learned over the years, though, was that not all the people that lived close to this park were coming to the parks. I think I first met Nina in 2006 when she did some research for us. We started looking at who's at our park. What we learned was the people who were at our park were mostly white. They were mostly wealthy. Over 80% of the people that came to our park, in fact, were white, wealthy, really highly educated, came all the time, which meant they lived right adjacent to the park. And then we started to want to know, well, who's not here and why aren't they here? And Nina did a lot of research and helped us look at this as well as some others. One of the things that we learned, so we learned things like transportation is a barrier. We learned experience is a barrier. If you haven't grown up doing this kind of stuff, going outdoors, that's a barrier. Information, basic information was a barrier. One of the people in one of the focus groups, I think that Nina did, said, look, if you know there's such a thing as national parks, then you know there's a national park in your city or town, and then you know there's such a thing as a visitor center, and then you can figure out how to get to the visitor center, then you can get a lot of information about what to do and where to go. But that is a lot, those are a lot of hurdles for people to overcome. So my job, one of the fun things I get to do is really figure out, take things like this kind of research and figure out, like, let's do something with that research. We know this now, what can we try to address it? So I was really interested in, let's take visitor centers out of the park. Let's not have them in the park anymore. Let's take them to where people are. So this baby of mine, the roving ranger, took about 4 years to birth, but it came into the world about 3 years ago. This is what it looks like from the inside. It's a recycled bread truck, and part of this is like, I don't know if New Haven is the same as San
Innovation.
Francisco, but food trucks are like super popular. So I thought, let's trick people into thinking that this is a food truck, but really it's park information. The roving ranger can go in the park, but it also goes all over the Bay Area into communities. This is a picture at San Francisco State where it goes every Wednesday to promote the academic internships that we have in the park. It has kind of developed its own following now. It has a fan club. People recognize it from different parts of the country, I mean of the counties that we work in. It's pretty economical, too. It costs about $80,000 to build this truck, to buy it, to kit it out, and takes about $10,000 a year to maintain, including insurance. It's reached almost 45,000 people in those few years that it's been running. Fun. Another thing that we tried, the community shuttle. This was to try and get at the transportation issue. Thought, okay, transportation, people say, is why they don't come. Let's provide it. Let's do the transportation. So we got all excited, raised some money, decided we're going to do this bus, essentially, like make it like a city bus, only it'll pick people up in their neighborhoods and take them to the park. We decided to partner with the neighborhood of Bayview Hunters Point, which is basically the farthest neighborhood away from our park, largely African American and Asian community. People who, it takes a while. If you're trying to get there on public transportation from Bayview to our park, it takes a long time, and it's complicated. So we got this community, we got buses, we met with all these community organizations. We said, if we do this, will people show up? Yes, yes, yes. We had our first day. It was a pilot program in October of 2013. Not one single person got on the bus that day. Not a single person got on the bus that day. It also happened to be the first day of the government shutdown in 2013, which wasn't helpful. But, you know, several of us who worked on this were practically crying like, oh, well, that's it. So we went that Monday after our first shuttle weekend. We went back to all these community folks. And we said, nobody rode the bus. Like, what? And they said, don't give up on us. Don't give up on us. We're going to figure out how to make this work. So we didn't. And now, 3 years later, we've brought over 1,000 people on the community shuttles. We learned a ton from that first failure, and I'm happy to talk to anybody about this. I mostly put this in because you might recognize someone. I have 3 minutes. Those are some of our people. We did a project with public libraries this summer. All I'm really going to say about this is for the Centennial year, we first started talking, well, should we partner with city parks or state parks, or what should we do? And then we thought, we really want to reach out to neighborhoods that don't know about the park. What organization has a presence in every single neighborhood? And we decided that was our libraries. They have 28 branch libraries in the city. The libraries got super excited about this. The librarians are like, yeah, we're all about information. We're not just about books. We're like a community center. So they made their summer reading program about the libraries. About the parks. We put little mini trailheads in all the library branches. We developed a special trailhead for teenagers, with teenagers. All I'll say about this is that they are not interested in the same things that we are. One of the things they really wanted to know is where were the best selfie spots in the park. So we included that on our trailhead there. We put parks in the libraries in the park. So these are free book exchanges. They were very popular. I'm going to say a little bit about our art program. This is one of the things I've been working on over the last few years. These are just some examples. What I really like about the arts, this is cool because it walks. I don't know if you've ever heard of Theo Janssen. He's a Dutch artist. He makes the strand beasts. We had them come and walk on our beaches this past spring, and our young people got to meet with the artist and talk to him about how he designs these and why, and evolution and beach ecology, and it was really cool. But one of the things that we have learned about art and that we are really exploring, again, back to this idea of how can parks really be part of the vibrant conversation in civic society, and parks really as catalysts for social change. So in 2013, we started planning for an exhibition that we did on Alcatraz called At Large, Ai Weiwei on Alcatraz. Anybody here ever heard of Ai Weiwei before? Oh, wow, way more people than I would have thought of. Mostly I have to talk about the Bird's Nest Stadium in the Beijing Olympics. But the idea here was, oh no, did I press one of those horrible buttons? Let's see.
There's your tech guy. Everybody
Told
needs a
me
tech
not
guy.
to do this, and then of course I did it.
Or girl.
There we go. Okay. There's 2 buttons on here in case you ever do this that you're not supposed to ever touch, and I apparently just touched one. So one of the reasons we were interested in Ai Weiwei was this. My favorite word, it's act. Is there a way that we could use the arts to get people to actually change their behavior or do something in connection to a park? We partnered with an organization called the Foresight Foundation. They do Art About Place. Really, they're art curators and visionaries as far as engaging artists in place-based work. This is actually modeled on a bird's wing. It's in a part of Alcatraz that looks out to one of the major bird nesting colonies in the entire Pacific on Alcatraz. This is called Trace. It was portraits of 176 prisoners of conscience from around the world, all made out of 1.2 million Legos that almost 90 volunteers helped us put together for 5 weeks before the exhibition opened. These are people who came from all over the Bay Area to look at people who were from the countries that they were from. And I think, one of the, so we had the question is, like, people come to Alcatraz, you've all heard of Alcatraz, mostly probably what you've heard of is Al Capone and the gangster era. We knew that Alcatraz was really a lot more interesting than that. It has kind of one of the origins of Native American civil rights movement started on Alcatraz. It has a really incredible nesting bird population. Most local residents think it's part of Fisherman's Wharf, maybe. It's a horrible tourist trap. They actively avoid it. We, as a parks conservancy and a park, really depend on our local people to help us maintain and care for and donate to our park locations. So we wanted to bring people to Alcatraz, we wanted to engage them in these other stories of Alcatraz, and we wanted to use the prison setting to have people start thinking about some of the really important contemporary issues that we face. Issues of incarceration, confinement, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. So this last piece, this is called Yours Truly, and it was sort of experimental. The artist decided to ask people who'd seen the exhibit to write a postcard to one of the prisoners of conscience at the end of their trip through the island and the exhibition. We thought, is anyone really going to do that? We had 93,000 people that wrote postcards to prisoners of conscience from around the world. We had almost 900,000 people come through the exhibition. We had 173% increase in visitors to Alcatraz from San Francisco, 74% increase from the Bay Area. So it was really exciting and great. We just opened a new one this past weekend. It's called Homeland Security. It engages 18 artists from all around the world looking at those very issues. What does home mean to you? What does land mean? What does security mean in an era of global forced migrations and humanitarian crises? These batteries, this is in the Presidio looking north to the Marin Headlands, these batteries are the physical manifestation of what Homeland Security meant when they were built. So this is the location. All these batteries have been reopened up for the first time to the public to show these stories, and this is just an example of one of the works there. I just showed this slide because I think it's back to this issue of parks as places of reconciliation and civic dialogue. This message, which I don't know if you can read, it's graffiti that if you read from left to right says, Ohlone Sacred Land. This message showed up on these batteries the day before the exhibition opened. You can imagine the Park Service has issues with graffiti all over. There was a lot of conversation. What should we do? Should we take it out? And basically everybody decided, this is part of the conversation. This is part of the whole point. And so far we've had a huge interest in all of our immigrant communities in coming to this. So this is kind of just some examples of things that we've done. Those last Twitter handles and things are because I promised Vita Banerjee from my communications department I would put those on there. So that's it.
Excellent. Great, thank you. Did I flip this back on okay? So folks that came in late, yes, a wonderful panel, great case examples, excellent ideas to think about. And one of the things that what I want to do is just recap. And for folks that came in late and may have missed an introduction on who are these people anyway, their bios are on the Center for Ecology, the Urban Ecology website. Definitely take a look at their backgrounds. Contact them if you want more information. They're very receptive and responsive to anything you might want to know. So what I want to do is I just want to take a minute and recap a couple of things. We're doing fine on time. We're going to open it up to Q&A to these guys. We've got a couple of questions, and after listening to their talks, of course, I have some other questions, and then we're going to open it up to any comments or questions that you might have. So initially, Michael, he talked about case studies in California, right? Environmental justice, cap and trade, how parks are multi-purpose, multi-project. There's a need for more research, a need for additional grants. And then he talked a little bit about policy implications. This is just kind of capturing some of what I was listening to. Jamaica Bay, Adam talked about Jamaica Bay, the history, evolution, loss of habitat and wetlands, but yet the rebuilding and revitalization, the transit system. He got into parklands being protected, the ecological value regarding health and biodiversity, watershed protection plan, development of the Science and Resilience Institute, of which he works, and also got into the fact that there's different meanings and definitions of what resilience is, and I encourage you to think about that as well. Kate, who we just heard from, parks have many roles to play, and the fact that there's a need to involve people through civic engagement. Parks and nature as changing lives. She talked about the intersection of public land lands and other institutions. She talked about the need for access, and what does that mean? Access is a big issue still. She got into a few of the constraints of which we've been studying really for over 50 years, and how users engage or don't engage, and then putting research into action. We heard a whole variety of things that they're doing out in the Bay Area, in addition to here on the East Coast. So a couple things. So since Kate ended, I'm going to go ahead and open a question for Kate. When we think about the kinds of things that you're doing, right, and amazing work, and in many of the places that we live and work and play, the economic realities will vary in terms of the communities we're trying to reach or want to involve in parks and protected areas. So how would you say, how are the changing economic realities in places like the Bay Area, San Francisco, Oakland, Richmond, and the areas where you're working, how does that affect visitor use or volunteerism? What do you suppose the connection is in terms of the economics that may be happening in the Bay Area? It's a big question, but we'll give you a minute or two to answer.
If I could answer that, I would make a lot of money.
That's true. That's a good answer. Now, next question. Okay.
Start with the softball.
Yeah, it is a really big issue. I mean, we're having an issue. I think, one of the big things is diversifying our staff, both at our organization and our partner federal agencies. We need to do that by starting, like many environmental organizations, really recruiting young people to come in sort of at the entry level and then mentor them up. It's really hard for young people to stay in the Bay Area and work in the Bay Area, so we're seeing a real issue there. I do think that people are starting to see, though, the park as a real career opportunity, and I think young people, I showed the roving ranger at San Francisco State. I think we have close to 50 or 60 academic interns that come every year now, and we have probably 500 applications for those. So people are really starting to see the value of getting involved and that there are real career opportunities. Do you have that? I mean, I'm assuming New York is the same way, and LA.
Yeah, no, that's a really important factor in terms of generating young people, but really talking about the career opportunities and many young people who are looking for paid internships or jobs after, and they're starting to think about how their economic realities will impact their involvement and their contribution to parks. But I want to move on to Adam too. Thank you, Kate. In terms of climate change, which has been a big issue, and it's been a big problem and a big challenge in our communities and around the globe, with the work that you talked about, how do you suppose that climate change and the notion of inequality, how will that potentially affect, say, urban America looking ahead in the next 10 or 20 years? What do you suppose that connection will be, and how will things improve? Hopefully we're moving in that direction. How can you respond to that?
Sure. Well, I think with everything to do with climate change, the really emphasis is on choice, right? So we can mitigate and adapt to climate change, but that requires that we make certain choices. So all of those different shared priorities, those all reflect choices, some of which actually create opportunities for better equality. So the participatory budgeting stuff, the way we're trying to get folks to weigh in on values and perceptions of flood protection, for example. So we have a survey that's open, I think it's still open, coastal-values.org. It's a social scientist who's trying to get out in the community through the online survey, through interviewing people in person, distributing the survey to really try to understand what are people's perspectives and priorities with respect to reducing flood exposure. And that's important to equality because, otherwise, if we don't gather that kind of perspective and we don't create those kinds of mechanisms and that kind of discourse, particularly in a post-disaster setting, it would be really easy to sort of revert to what the agencies who are feeling political pressure to, understandably, to protect people want or think is the best option, or whatever the science says, which is an important part of the equation. But you have to create dialogues around these priorities and then help empower people to know that those are choices.
Excellent. Yeah, and that's a lot of, in terms of behavior change and the sorts of things that we're trying to shift, which is a good segue into a policy question. Michael talked a little bit about policy implications, right? So question that we have for Michael is, think about the role of developing and implementing policies. What role does that play in terms of agencies, causing agencies to shift and challenge their thinking? Because that's a lot of what I see as a gap sometimes. You can create policies, but how does that shift the paradigm of how the agencies operate? So thinking about mandates in that respect. So what might you say about that? How do policies really shift the way agencies think?
I think it really takes leadership, because a lot of these departments and bureaucrats and other very technical focused type of experts that work within these engineering departments and even in Parks and Rec, sanitation, and various others are very entrenched in doing business as usual in terms of this is how we've been doing basically 20th century type of infrastructure. And when they're asked to collaborate on these multi-benefit type of projects, it's like you're changing the rules. There's a lot of gray areas of what jurisdiction, who has jurisdiction, or where a law or policy should be lax. So from what I've seen, it takes really leadership actually from the city council, from the board of supervisors, and depending on the type of funding it has from the state legislature. So for me, what I see is, again, having that social environmental movement, really pressuring that we want these type of projects, and to have leadership from the policymakers themselves directing staff to do this. I've even seen that policymakers actually go to the meetings, the staff meetings, and sit there and make sure that these bureaucrats and other staff experts actually work on the project and have a willingness to do it. Otherwise, it often falls to the crack. Just on that urban gardening thing, it's just the various different. It's a working urban farm. It's a community garden at the same time. It's a school site. It's supposed to be accessible to the public. Just getting parks to think differently about that was difficult, and that's just a park. But when you get into more kind of complicated, like watershed management practices, green alleys, that's even more technical and takes a larger hurdle.
Excellent. And along those lines, so thinking about all the different things that you've been hearing, this afternoon around policy, around engaging communities, around, restoration and how it affects the communities around us. So take that to another level. So you have, the value and importance of policy and legislation. How do you create more park advocates? How do we get the community truly to, the ladders of engagement, as we call them, from awareness to understanding, and to really contribute to the changes and shifts in both policy and how agencies do their work? Anybody who wants to respond to the connection of how do we create more park advocates to actually support us in doing our work and from a political and legislative standpoint? How do we do that? Another $10,000 question. How would you answer that? Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think getting more, I think we're trying to tackle that on sort of an organizational level, a project level, and an individual level. So on the organizational level, we're trying to, really, literally the governance of the organization is a means to break down some of the silos that Mike talked about and try to get some of the community groups and the public agencies in the room together, multiple public agencies with multiple mandates. On a project level, I think, I see a lot of promise in using different planning processes where you have agencies and communities walking through, framing the problem together, identifying solutions together. In a lot of cases, I think the solutions are actually already there, but they need to see them as the solution together. We pay a lot of attention to legitimate processes. Who needs to be in the room for any given issue on a project, whether it's flood exposure or ecological restoration or community resilience. And then on an individual level, it's really just finding the champions, the motivated people in the different parts of the Bay, because everything's pretty hyper-local. The transportation, there are sort of breakdowns in the transportation system. As I mentioned, there's only one subway line. Some of the ferry systems that go out to the Rockaways can't be accessed via bus or circulator routes for some of the most disadvantaged communities. So to figure out, hear that from the community and relay it back to the public agencies.
Excellent. Other thoughts on how do we foster the urban agenda through engaging our communities in other ways politically in terms of advocacy?
Well, one of the couple things for me that are sort of, I think, important is I do really think it's important to engage diversity and diverse audiences in parks. In California, our legislature is very, they represent very diverse audiences, and the leadership in our legislature represents those folks and really wants to know, like, when you come in the room, like, who's talking to them about whatever kind of change, policy level change you're proposing. So I think when the people who show up to speak on your behalf are not the same old usual suspects, it's really helpful. And, I think, like, for me, one of the things with the shuttle program that I learned that was really interesting is really starting with communities, not by thinking about what they can do for you, but by thinking about what you can do for them as a park, and then doing that, and then they really do become your advocate. I had somebody come up and say they were coming, actually, we were talking about a presentation that they were going to make in front of a city body on behalf of the park. And, they said, here's the thing. This was an African-American gentleman who had never really spent much time in the park. He said, he's probably been on like 30 or 35 trips with us now on the shuttle. He said, I own this park, is what he said. He's been treated as a VIP for 30 or 35 trips, and now he feels he owns it. He's not just welcome there, but it's his. And so which to me was like, just saying it in that way really indicated a big difference. And then the other thing is just kind of, again, surprise people. Like, for me, the library thing's been really great. Like, the city librarian of San Francisco has become like Mr. Park now, which is really interesting. And again, not the usual person that would show up and speak on your behalf or what have you. And then those people also have connections to other city agencies, their peers and colleagues, that they can, help you get somebody to come around.
Excellent. Yeah, and there's obviously a lot of strategies, but those are very good. And something else to add? Sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to go ahead, Mike.
I would just add that, again, it takes a multi-pronged approach between grassroots, grass tops being, just not environmental justice groups, but mainstream environmentalists, policymakers. And for what we see a lot about, to get more people involved, diverse people involved, is like there's two approaches. There's one, a sense of urgency and a trigger event. You mentioned Hurricane Sandy. You saw pictures of historic and massive flooding that happened in that Sun Valley community. But it's also incrementalism at the same time is as that large CBO tree people goes into these local communities and creating green spaces there, working with the local community and the parents and showing that you can have science education, you can have access to green space in their own backyard and bringing nature to actually end literally in their backyard across their street. So I think it takes these multiple prong type of approaches and bringing people together and showing the value of how do we create an urgency and more advocacy around parks.
Excellent. Yeah. And your response may tie into this. So I'm going to ask the panelists, our distinguished panelists, one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. Maybe, Adam, you can start thinking about that and the notion of really connecting advocates to assist us and support us in the idea of action, right, and changing behavior. Take that into the idea of future sustainability. How do we sustain this work over time? Demographics are changing, people's attitudes are changing, everything's changing. So how do we sustain the work that we're doing to maintain and protect these areas, in particular in this topic in terms of urban parks? How do we do that work?
Yeah, that is the challenge, right? You guys go ahead, Kate.
See, if you can answer that, you'll be everyone's hero.
Well, going back to, to me, sustainability is and equity and creating a safe and just place. One of the things that I would say we're trying to the role the Institute is trying to play is to be the neutral voice. So we work with advocates, we work with activists, but I think we also have to keep an eye on the horizon, because what I was going to say, I completely agree with what both Kate and Michael said, but we've got this interesting sort of thorny challenge in Jamaica Bay where the voices, the usual voices, and the folks that show up are actually the environmental groups who spend a lot of time in parks, and they've become those advocates, and they're kind of drowning out, in some cases, not intentionally, other communities who didn't know that they lived within 1,000 feet of the bay until Sandy happened. So they only see Jamaica Bay as a threat, and they've got about 9 other priorities before parks, like jobs and a whole bunch of other housing and a whole bunch of other issues. So for us, we're trying to create processes and institutional capacity to really maintain a dialogue over time. I think in some respects, there's not any one project or specific strategy that we could do for sustainability for the 22nd century, except maintain our credibility, legitimacy, and saliency in the community and be there.
Great. Show up, as they say, we have to show up, right? Any other last comments on that? We'll open it up.
Well, just one idea. This is something I've been thinking about lately, and it's kind of related to the art stuff that I was talking about. But one of the things that our research has shown when we talk to people who do care, who are our park activists, you ask them to describe why. They never say, it's because you preserve the mission blue butterfly habitat, or it's because the San Francisco garter snake needs this critical place. What they always go back to is some really personal and emotional experience that they had in a place. So it'll be about their, walk with their daughter before she left for college, and they had or their son's 5th birthday party, or and for me, one of the things that art does is really tap into that emotion and makes an emotional connection with people. And I feel like once people have that emotional connection, that will go a long way to sustaining the level of interest that will be required to deal with things like climate change and preserving species and resiliency and equity issues and that kind of thing.
Excellent. Very, very good. And so in the essence of time, we would like to go ahead and open it up. Any thoughts, questions, comments that you might have for our panel? Hand up over here in the back, please, sir. Oh, yeah, we got the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your presentations. One of the parks that I like to visit when I'm in the Bay Area is Rosie the Riveter, which is an example of an urban historical park that I think has a lot of relevance to post-industrial cities in the Rust Belt in the Northeast, like New Haven, because it leverages some of the tremendous industrial heritage, cultural heritage, historical resources of a place like Richmond and the former Kaiser shipyard. So I'm wondering if one of the Californians on the panel would want to comment about that as a model for kind of creating an anchor institution and stimulating economic development through one of these urban historical parks. We have one in Lowell, Massachusetts, too, which I think is a similar model, and there's one in development around the Colt Factory complex in Hartford. But I think this is a very interesting and significant model, and I'm wondering if you could comment.
Excellent, thank you. Panelists.
We've all lived there. Have you been there?
Yes, I've been
Rosie?
there.
We've all been to Rosie, so I think we all agree it's an awesome model.
It is a great model.
Park. I think that the Park Service, state parks are starting to do more again, that kind of intersection of nature and culture and civic life is a really kind of powerful model. I don't know what else to say about it, but I think it is a really good example. They also have an awesome ranger, Betty Lee, there. I don't know if any of you have heard about her, but I think she's the Park Service's oldest park ranger. And look her up online.
She's 92 years old.
She's amazing. Yeah.
Still doing her thing. Other thoughts on sort of the heritage? And that is a trend. We're seeing that even in city park agencies, municipal agencies are doing that, revitalizing, industrial areas. And so the NPS is really stepping up and doing more of that. Other thoughts on that? We could open it
I
up.
think one, if we look at other ones like Cesar Chavez Parks or Allensworth Park, in historically black communities or Latino communities, this idea of identity and placemaking, and where parks can serve as that a form of cultural hub and a form of making visibility and honoring past and culture. So I think that's where parks can actually play in that sort of placemaking and also facilitating that, because as we all know here, different groups, demographic groups, both in race and ethnicity as well as in age and gender, use parks differently. And I think Rosie the Riveter and these other parks I mentioned scattered throughout the United States all kind of honor that sort of idea.
Excellent. Yeah, very good. Thanks. Okay, so we have a question here. Okay, and then 2 and 3.
Hi, my name is Mark DeSantis. I'm a first-year MEM student here at Yale, and full disclosure, in my prior life, I was at the National Park Foundation right before coming here. So actually, to your point, really quickly, the Kellogg Foundation is actually doing a study using both Lowell and Rosie the Riveter as case studies for how the national parks can serve as spaces of racial healing. So I recommend you check that out. For our panelists, though, I just wanted to ask you, in light of kind of the current congressional climate and the tightening budget of the Park Service, I wanted to get your opinion on the role of the National Park Service and its next centennial in managing these public spaces and the programs that they offer, as well as the role of kind of third-party nonprofit organizations or even the private sector in delivering services to the American public. I mentioned that because we have a panel on the National Park Service with 4 people known from the National Park Services here, and so I wonder, I think that's fantastic. I think it's kind of maybe an indication of my question, but I wanted to get your opinion on kind of the trends moving forward.
Well, Nina, you can also answer this.
That's true.
Well, I think that is one of the things that the Park Service is focusing on for the Centennial is, what are we going to be in the 21st century? And I think the Park Service is changing, and I think they are more comfortable with nonprofit partners in particular, assisting in their interpretive mission, in their management and stewardship mission. But I know for our park, like all parks, I mean, it has not been easy, and that is one of the roles that my organization plays, is helping to fill the gap when, their budgets don't increase or they stay flat, but cost of living increases. I think it's also one of the reasons why we really need to make sure that people see why parks are relevant to them.
One of the things, and let me add real quick, is that, so I think just the current administration, Obama administration, in 2 years, they actually have designated 14 new national monuments and historic sites. 14, that's a lot in a couple of years. So what they're doing is, because the public lands, there's less acreage it's already taken up by somebody, private or public, and so they're moving more into the historic and idea of monuments in terms of preservation and protection to tell America's story, to tell the untold story. So looking for different and unique areas around the nation to actually preserve and protect in perpetuity in terms of future. The other thing is along the lines with what Kate was saying, as far as engaging these different communities, that's going to be huge. And so they are looking at new and different partnerships that they've never had before. And people the door's open. And so those conversations are starting in new ways, which is really valuable. But Adam, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, so I've been in my current post for about 1.5 years, and before that I worked at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and managed a $6 to $8 million research portfolio, but that was very societally focused and service-oriented. There's absolutely no question that the Park Service could use more funding, but it's also a little bit, I think the budget issue is a little bit of a red herring, to be honest with you, because, you can always use more money. That's going to take a tectonic shift because federal agencies are very path dependent. To me, actually, one of the things that's a little thornier is the issue of their mandate to preserve cultural and natural processes. And that is baked into the DNA of the Park Service. And so then when you start talking about trying to experiment with different strategies that may not look like what we've seen before or that are really new, you fly in the face of that mandate. Because there have been groups, I mean, the way that the Department of the Interior, including the Park Service, started their landscape conservation cooperatives and climate science centers was working with partners outside of the federal government. So, and that was a pretty big shift in the budget. So it can happen, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to result in the kind of change I think we're talking about.
In addition to realizing that they're not the only experts out there, that their partners have expertise that they need to tap into. Thank you. Question, and then we'll go here. About 5 or so more minutes.
I guess starting with Michael, I appreciate the Bay Area. I love the Presidio, but I'm struck by, I think twice now we've seen your census track of California, and very little of this discussion focuses on that or what that illustrates, it seems to me. And that coupled with the amazing gentrification that's going on in the cities. When you started talking about income, I thought you were going to get to not only do the people right next to the Presidio have a high standard of living, but everybody in San Francisco is starting to have a high standard of living. I mean, not everybody, but the trend is that direction. Maybe not out near San Francisco State so much. But so I'm just wondering, in the next 100 years, let's say, since we're looking at that, what responsibility does the National Park System have to the Central Valley or to the East Bay, where there were a few other little red spots? We can bring people from Hunters Point to the Presidio, but that doesn't really get to this question of these other populations that are not discussed, maybe.
Well, that's actually my other research project looking at water issues in the Central Valley. But in terms of climate change, sustainability, it's changing. I think it's a political climate in the Central Valley. Yesterday we had Senator Flores, who represented the San Joaquin Valley, Central Valley, one of the key innovators in moving climate change agenda forward. Looking at the local scale, getting those projects there, it's been difficult having that climate kind of talk there, but also the funding. There's been the funding itself hasn't the original funding that you saw for the cap and trade. Large majority have gone to LA and the Bay Area. That sensitive graphic of the state and the inequality and environmental inequality. That's 3.0 now. That's the third iteration of that, and now the third iteration of that has a high emphasis on the Central Valley, so most of the funds are going to get there and get to the Central Valley now. So we'll see a shift there. And that actually came out through the legislators from the Central Valley saying we're not getting any of the funding for cap and trade. So we'll start seeing a shift in there. And then in terms of gentrification, there's been a lot of great research lately called green gentrification. If you're interested in that, Jennifer Walsh at UC Berkeley has a great article on green gentrification, talking about everything that was, all these small projects are in some places, if we just exclude the Bay Area that has hyper gentrification, if we look at other places, these urban green redevelopment projects in some instances are encouraging green gentrification. So it's the flip side. You want to help restore, formerly toxic brownfield sites, make green spaces, beautify the area, but how do you keep it for it still serves the low-income communities of color without displacing them? And it's a hard proposition, and it's a challenge. And at least in Walsh and other researchers have said, one opportunity is to create these smaller urban parks, these smaller, not massive parks, and going into areas just like doing school greening kind of maintains incremental improvements and maintains the community cohesiveness over time. And it's not like a huge, massive shock to the area. So that's one interpretation, but I don't think, as you were saying, there's an easy answer to gentrification or green gentrification.
Rural-urban interface, a wildland-urban interface. I'm looking at the clock, and so we can put a wrap? Because I know there's other things going on this evening, and it's getting around dinner time. So apologies we didn't get to other questions. Thank you again. Please give it up for the panel. Thank you for being here.